Hello, everyone. Thank you again for showing up. So tonight, we're going to finish off the story of Noah and also the story of the Tower of Babel. And I don't think that'll take very long. And then we're going to turn to the Abrahamic stories. And they're a very complex set of stories. They sit between the earliest stories in Genesis that I would say end with the Tower of Babel, and then the stories of Moses, which are extraordinarily well developed. The Abrahamic stories, there's a whole sequence of them, multiple stories conjoined together, and I found them very daunting. They're very difficult to understand. And so I'm going to stumble through them the best that I can, I would say. That's probably the best way to think about this, because they have a narrative content that's quite strange. I was reading a book while doing this called The Disappearance of God that I found quite helpful. And the author of that book argues that one of the things that happens in the Old Testament is that God is very manifest at the beginning, in terms of personal appearances even. And then that proclivity fades away as the Old Testament develops. And there's a parallel development that's maybe causally linked. I'm not exactly sure how to conceptualize it, but that appears to be causally linked, is that the stories about individuals become more and more well developed. So it's as if as God fades away, so to speak, the individual becomes more and more manifest. And there's a statement in the Old Testament, the location of which I don't recall, but I'll tell you about it in future lectures, where God essentially tells whoever he's speaking with, and I don't remember who that is, that he's going to disappear and let man essentially go his own way and see what happens. Not a complete disappearance, but maybe a transformation into something that modern people would regard more as a psychological phenomena rather than the sort of objective entity that God seems to be in the beginning of the biblical stories. And so I've been wrestling with that a lot, because the notion that God appears to Abraham multiple times, and that's not a concept that's easy for modern people to grasp. For us, generally speaking, apart from, say, issues of faith, God isn't someone who makes himself personally manifest in our lives. He doesn't appear to us. That's, I suppose, why the question of belief is so paramount for modern people. I presume that if God was in the habit of appearing to you, you likely wouldn't have a problem with belief. I mean, it might be more complicated than that, but that's how it seems to me. And so when we read stories about God making himself manifest, either to a nation, say in the case of Israel, or to individuals, it's not easy to understand. It's not easy to understand why people would write stories like that if they thought like we thought. And I mean, really, it wasn't that long ago that the Bible was written, say, from a biological perspective. It's really only yesterday. It's a couple of thousand years, say 4,000 years, something like that. That's not very long ago. From a biological perspective, it's nothing. So the first thing I tried to do was to see if I could figure out how to understand that. And so I'll start the lecture once we finish the remains of the story of Noah. I'll start the lecture with an attempt to situate the Abrahamic stories in a context that might make them more accessible, at least a context that worked for me to make them more accessible. Let's conclude the Noah story first, however. When we ended last time, the ark had come to its resting place, and Noah and his family had debarked. And so this is the stories of what occurs immediately afterwards. It's a very short story, but I think it's very relevant for both of these stories, the Tower of Babel as well, very relevant for our current times. And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed shall be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Okay, so I remember thinking about this story. It's got to be 30 years ago. And I think the meaning of the story stood out for me. Sometimes, when you read complicated material, sometimes a piece of it will stand out. It's, for some reason, it's like it glitters, I suppose. That might be one way of thinking about it. You're in sync with it, and you can understand what it means. I've really experienced that reading the Tao Te Ching, which is a document I would really like to do a lecture on at some point. Because some of the verses I don't understand, but others stand right out and I can understand them. And I think I understood what this part of the story of Noah meant. And I think it means, we talked a little bit about what nakedness meant in the story of Adam and Eve. And the idea essentially was that to know yourself naked is to become aware of your vulnerability, your physical boundaries in time and space, and your fundamental physiological insufficiencies as they might be judged by others. So there's biological insufficiency that's sort of built into you because you're a fragile, mortal, vulnerable, half-insane creature, and that's just an existential truth. And then, of course, even merely as a human being, even with all those faults, there are faults that you have that are particular to you that might be judged harshly by the group. Well, will definitely be judged harshly by the group. And so to become aware of your nakedness is to become self-conscious and to know your limits and to know your vulnerability. And that's what is revealed to Ham when he comes across his father naked. And so the question is, what does it mean to see your father naked? And it seems to me, and especially in an inappropriate manner like this, it's as if Ham, he does the same thing that happens in the Mesopotamian creation myth when Tiamat and Apsu give rise to the first gods. They're the father of the eventual deity of redemption, Marduk. They're very careless and noisy, and they kill Apsu, their father, and attempt to inhabit his corpse. And that makes Tiamat enraged, and so she bursts forth from the darkness to do them in. It's like a precursor to the flood story, or an analog to the flood story. And I see the same thing happening here with Ham, is that he's insufficiently respectful of his father. And the question is exactly, what does the father represent? And you could say, well, there's the father that you have, and that's a human being, that's a man like other men, a man among men, but then there's the father as such, and that's the spirit of the father. And insofar as you have a father, you have both at the same time. You have the personal father that's a man among other men, just like anyone else's father. But insofar as that man is your father, that means that he's something different than just another person. And what he is the incarnation of the spirit of the Father. And to see that, to take it to what? To disrespect that carelessly. Maybe even, like Noah makes a mistake, right? He produces wine and gets himself drunk. And you might say, well, if he's sprawled out there for everyone to see, it's hardly Ham's fault if he stumbles across him. But the book is laying out a danger, and the danger is that, well, maybe you catch your father at his most vulnerable moment, and if you're disrespectful, then you transgress against the spirit of the Father, and if you transgress against the spirit of the Father and lose respect for the spirit of the Father, then that is likely to transform you into a slave. That's a very interesting idea, and I think it's particularly interesting, maybe not particularly interesting, but it's particularly germane, I think, to our current cultural situation, because I think that we're pushed constantly to see the nakedness of our Father, so to speak, because of the intense criticism that's directed towards our culture and the patriarchal culture, so to speak. We're constantly exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities and, let's say, nakedness. And there's nothing wrong with criticism, but the thing about criticism is the purpose of criticism is to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not to burn everything to the ground, right? It's to say, well, we're going to carefully look at this. We're going to carefully differentiate. We're going to keep what's good, and we're going to move away from what's bad. But the point of the criticism isn't to identify everything as bad. It's to separate what's good from what's bad so that you can retain what's good and move towards it. And to be careless at that is deadly, because you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father, right? Insofar as you're a cultural construction, which of course is something that the postmodern neo-Marxists are absolutely emphatic about. You're a cultural construction. Insofar as you're a cultural construction, then you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father, and to be disrespectful towards that means to undermine the very structure that makes you not all of what you are, certainly not all of what you are, but a good portion of what you are, insofar as you're a socialized cultural entity. And if you pull the foundation out from underneath that, what do you have left? You can hardly manage on your own. It's just not possible. You're a cultural creation. And so Ham makes this desperate error and is careless about exposing himself to the vulnerability of his father, something like that. He does it without sufficient respect. And the judgment is that not only will he be a slave, but so will all of his descendants. And he's contrasted with the other two sons who, I suppose, are willing to give their father the benefit of the doubt, something like that. And so when they see him in a compromising position, they handle it with respect and don't capitalize on it. And maybe that makes them strong. That's what it seems to me. And so I think that's what that story means. It has something to do with respect. And the funny thing about having respect for your culture, and I suppose that's partly why I'm doing the biblical stories, is because they're part of my culture. They're part of our culture, perhaps, but they're certainly part of my culture. And it seems to me that it's worthwhile to treat that with respect, to see what you can glean from it, and not kick it when it's down, let's say. So that's how the story of Noah ends. And the thing too is Noah is actually a pretty decent incarnation of the Spirit of the Father, which I suppose is one of the things that makes Ham's misstep more egregious, is that, Noah just built an ark and got everybody through the flood, man, It's not so bad. And so maybe the fact that he happened to drink too much wine one day wasn't enough to justify humiliating him. And I don't think it's pushing the limits of symbolic interpretation to note on a daily basis that we're all contained in an ark, right? And that's the ark that, you could think about that as the ark that's been bequeathed to us by our forefathers. That's the tremendous infrastructure that we inhabit, that we take for granted, because it works so well, that protects us from things that we can't even imagine, and we don't have to imagine because we're so well protected. And so one of the things that's really struck me hard, I would say, about the disintegration and corruption of the universities is the absolute ingratitude that goes along with that. Criticism, as I said, is a fine thing if it's done in a proper spirit. And that's the spirit of separating the wheat from the chaff. But it needs to be accompanied by gratitude. And it does seem to me that anyone who lives in the West, in the Western culture at this time in history and in this place, and who isn't simultaneously grateful for that is half blind, at least, because it's never been better than this. And it could be so much worse. And it's highly likely that it will be so much worse, because for most of human history, so much worse is the norm. So, then there's this little story that crops up that seems in some ways unrelated to everything that's gone before it. But I think it's also an extremely profound little story. It took me a long time to figure it out. It's the Tower of Babel. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and dwelt there. That's Noah's descendants. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, "Go, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. So they're establishing a city. And they said, "Go, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and now this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. It's a very difficult story to understand. On the face of it, it doesn't seem to show God in a very good light, although that happens fairly frequently in the Old Testament, as far as I can tell. But, the thing to do, if you're reading in the spirit of the text, let's say, is to remember that it's God that you're talking about. And so, even though you might think that he's appearing in a bad light, your duty as a reader, I suppose, is to assume that you're wrong and that what he did was right. And then you're supposed to figure out, well, how could it possibly be right? Because the axiomatic presupposition is that it's God and whatever he does is right. And you might say, well, you can disagree with that. And it's also the case that some of the people that God talks to in the Old Testament actually disagree with him and convince him to alter his actions. But the point still remains that it's God, and if he's doing it, then by definition, there's a good reason. There's an idea much later that John Milton develops in Paradise Lost, which is an amazing poem. And it's a profound enough poem so that it's almost been incorporated into the biblical structure, I would say. So the corpus of Christianity post-Milton was saturated by the Miltonic stories of Satan's rebellion. None of that's in the biblical texts, or it's only hinted at in very brief passages. And Milton wrote his poem to justify the ways of God to man, which is quite an ambition. Really, it's an amazing, profound ambition to try to produce something, to produce a literary work that justifies being to human beings, because that's what Milton was trying to do. So one of my readers here sent me a link the other day, or viewers, to a work of philosophy by an Australian philosopher whose name I don't remember, who basically wrote a book saying that being as such, human experience, is so corrupt and so permeated by suffering that it would be better if it had never existed at all. It's sort of the ultimate expression of nihilism. And Goethe in Faust, his Mephistopheles, who's a satanic character, obviously, has that as a credo. That's Satan's fundamental motivation, is his objection to creation itself is that creation is so flawed and so rife with suffering that it would be better if it had never existed at all. And so that's his motivation for attempting to continue to destroy it. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is an intellectual figure. And you see that motif emerge very frequently, by the way, in popular culture. So, for example, in The Lion King, the figure of Scar, who's a satanic figure, is also hyper-intellectual. And that's very common. That, you know, it's the evil scientist motif, or the evil advisor to the king, the same motif. It encapsulates something about rationality, and what it seems to encapsulate is the idea that rationality, like Satan, is the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. It's a psychological idea, you know, that the most powerful sub-element of the human psyche is the intellect. And it's the thing that shines out above all, within the domain of humanity and maybe across the domain of life itself. The human intellect, there's something absolutely remarkable about it, but it has a flaw, and the flaw is that it tends to fall in love with its own productions and to assume that they're total. Solzhenitsyn, when he was writing the Gulag Archipelago, had a warning about that with regards to totalitarian ideology. And he said that the price of selling your God-given soul to the entrapments of human dogma was slavery and death, essentially. And Satan, in Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan decides that he can do without the transcendent, he can do without God, and that's why he foments rebellion. It's something like that. And the consequence of that, the immediate consequence from Milton's perspective, was that as soon as Satan decided that what he knew was sufficient and that he could do without the transcendent, which you might think about as the domain outside of what you know, something like that, immediately he was in hell. And when I read Paradise Lost, I was studying totalitarianism, and I thought, you know, the poet, the true poet, like a prophet, is someone who has intimations of the future. And maybe that's because the poetic mind, the philosophical or prophetic mind, is a pattern detector, and there are people who can detect the underlying, it's like the melody of a nation, melody as in song, the song of a nation, and can see how it's going to develop across the centuries. You see that in Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, for example, in the around 1860 or so, I mean, he prophesied what was going to happen in the 20th century. He said specifically that the specter of communism would kill millions of people in the 20th century. It's an amazing prophecy. He said that in the notes that became Will to Power. And Dostoevsky was of the same sort of mind, someone who was in touch enough with the fundamental patterns of human movement that they could extrapolate out into the future and see what was coming. And I mean, some people are very good at detecting patterns, you know, and Milton, I think, was of that sort. And I think he had intimations of what was coming as human rationality became more and more powerful and technology became more and more powerful. And the intimation was that we would produce systems that dispensed with God, that were completely rational and completely total, that would immediately turn everything they touched into something indistinguishable from hell. And Milton's warning was, and it's embodied in the poem, is that the rational mind that generates a production and then worships it as if it's absolute immediately occupies hell. So what does that have to do with the Tower of Babel? Well, you know what? Back in 2008, when we had that economic collapse, this strange idea emerged politically, and that was the idea of too big to fail. And I thought about that idea for a long time because I thought, there's something deeply wrong with that. Is one of the things that made Marx wrong was Marx believed that capital would flow into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that the dissociation between the rich and the poor would become more extreme as capitalism developed. And like so many things that Marx said, it's kind of true. It's kind of true in that the distribution of wealth, and in fact the distribution of anything that's produced, follows a Pareto pattern. And the Pareto pattern basically is that a small proportion of people end up with the bulk of the goods. And it isn't just money. It's anything that people produce creatively ends up in that distribution. And that's actually, the economists call that the Matthew principle, and they take that from a statement in the New Testament, and the statement is, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And it's a map of the manner in which the world manifests itself, where human creative production is involved, and the map seems to indicate that as you start to produce and you're successful, the probability that you will continue to be successful or accelerate increases as you're successful. And as you fail, the probability that you will fail starts to accelerate. So your progress through life looks like this, or like this, something like that. And the reason that Marx was right was because he noted that as a feature of the capitalist system. The reason that he was wrong is that it's not a feature that's specific to a capitalist system. It's a feature that's general to all systems of creative production that are known. And so it's like a natural law, and it's enough of a natural law, by the way, that the distribution of wealth can be modeled by physical models using the same equations that govern the distribution of gas molecules in a vacuum. So it's a really profound, it's a fundamentally profound observation about the world, way the world lays itself out. And it's problematic because if resources accrue unfairly to a small minority of people, and there's a natural law-like element to that that has to be dealt with from a social perspective, because if the inequality becomes too extreme, then the whole system will destabilize. And so you can have an intelligent discussion about how to mitigate the effects of the transfer of creative production into the hands of a small number of people. Now, the other reason, however, having said that, the other reason that Marx was wrong, there's a number of them. One is that even though creative products end up in the hands of a small number of people, it's not the same people consistently across time. It's the same proportion of people. And that's not the same thing. You know, like, imagine that there's water going down a drain, and you say, well, look at the spiral. It's permanent. You think, well, the spiral's permanent, but the water molecules aren't. They're moving through it. And it's the same in some sense with the Pareto distribution, is that there's a 1%, and there's always a 1%, but it's not the same people. The stability of it differs from culture to culture, but there's a lot of movement in the upper 1%, a tremendous amount of movement. And one of the reasons for that movement is that things get large, and then they get too large, and then they collapse. And so, in 2008, when the politicians said, too big to fail, they got something truly backwards, as far as I can tell, and that was, it was a reverse, the statement was reversed. It should have been so big it had to fail. And that's what I think the story of the Tower of Babel is about. It's a warning against the expansion of a system until it encompasses everything. It's a warning against totalitarian presumption. So what happens, for example, when people set out to build the Tower of Babel is they want to build a structure that reaches to heaven. Right, so the idea is that it can replace the role of God. It's something like that. It can erase the distinction between earth and heaven. And so there's a utopian kind of vision there as well. As we can build a structure that's so large and encompassing that it can replace heaven itself. And that's an interesting. The fact that doesn't work and that God objects to it is also extraordinarily interesting. And it's an indication to me of the unbelievable profundity of these stories. It's like, I think one thing we should have learned from the 20th century, but of course didn't, was that there's something extraordinarily dangerous about totalitarian utopian visions. That's something Dostoevsky wrote about, by the way, in his great book, Notes from Underground, because Dostoevsky had figured out by the early 1900s that there was something very, very pathological about a utopian vision of perfection, that it was profoundly anti-human. And in Notes from Underground, he demolishes the notion of utopia. One of the things he says that I loved, it's so brilliant. He said, imagine that you brought the socialist utopia into being, And Dostoevsky says, and that human beings had nothing to do except eat, drink, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. He said that the first thing that would happen under circumstances like that would be that human beings would go mad and break the system, smash it, just so that something unexpected and crazy could happen, because human beings don't want utopian comfort and certainty. They want adventure and chaos and uncertainty. And so that the very notion of a utopia was anti-human, because we're not built for static utopia. We're built for a dynamic situation where there's demands placed on us and where there's the optimal amount of uncertainty. Well, we know what happened in the 20th century as a consequence of the widespread promulgation of utopian schemes. And what happened was mayhem on a scale that had never been matched in the entire history of humanity. And that's really saying something, because there was plenty of mayhem before the 20th century. I guess there wasn't as much industrial clout behind it. And so early, you see, so early in the biblical narrative, you have a warning against hubris and some indication that properly functioning systems have an appropriate scale. I read an article in The Economist magazine this week about the rise of nationalist movements all over the world as a counterbalance to globalization. Maybe it's most marked with the European Economic Community. And The Economist writers were curious about why that counter-movement has been developing, but it seems to me that it's also a Tower of Babel phenomena, is that, and maybe this is most evident in the European Economic Community, to bring all of that multiplicity under the, what would you call it, under the umbrella of a single unity, is to simultaneously erect a system where the top is so far from the bottom that the bottom has no connection to the top. You know, your social systems have to be large enough so they protect you, but small enough so that you have a place in them. And it seems to me perhaps that's what's happened in places like the EEC, is that the distance between the typical citizen and the bureaucracy that runs the entire structure has got so great that it's an element of destabilization in and of itself. And so people revert back to, say, nationalistic identities because it's something that they can relate to. There's a history there and a shared identity, a genuine identity, an identity of language and tradition that's not an artificial imposition from the top, an artificial abstract imposition. In the Egyptian creation myth, the version I'm most familiar with, in the previous creation myth, an older one, the Mesopotamian creation myth, mostly what you see menacing humanity is Tiamat. She's the dragon of chaos, and so that's nature. It's really Mother Nature, red in tooth and claw. But by the time the Egyptians come along, it isn't only nature that threatens humanity, it's the social structure itself. And so the Egyptians had two deities that represented the social structure, and one was Osiris, who was like the spirit of the father. He was a great hero who established Egypt, but became old and willfully blind and senile. And he had an evil brother named Seth. And Seth was always conspiring to overthrow him. And because Osiris ignored him long enough, Seth did overthrow him, chopped him into pieces and distributed him all around the kingdom. And his son Horus had to come back and fight. Osiris's son Horus had to come back and defeat Seth to take the kingdom back. And that's how that story ends. But the Egyptians seem to have realized, maybe because they had become bureaucratized to quite a substantial degree, that it wasn't only nature that threatened humankind. It was also the proclivity of human organizations to become too large, too unwieldy, too deceitful, and too willfully blind, and therefore liable to collapse. And again, I see echoes of that in this story of the Tower of Babel. So, it's a calling for a kind of humility of social engineering. One of the other things I've learned as a social scientist, and I've been warned about this by, I would say, great social scientists, that you want to be very careful about doing large-scale experimentation with large-scale systems. Because the probability that if you implement a scheme in a large-scale social system, that scheme will have the result you intended is negligible. What will happen will be something that you don't intend, and even worse, something that works at counter purposes to your original intent. And so, and that makes sense, because if you have a very, very complex system and you perturb it, the probability that you can predict the consequence of the perturbation is extraordinarily low, obviously. If a system works, though, you think you understand it because it works. And so you think it's simpler than it actually is. And so then you think that your model of it is correct. And then you think that your manipulation of the model, which produces the outcome you model, will be the outcome that's actually produced in the world. And that doesn't work at all. I thought about that an awful lot, thinking about how to remediate social systems, because obviously they need careful attention and adjustment. And it struck me that the proper strategy for implementing social change is to stay within your domain of competence. And that requires humility, which is a virtue that is never promoted in modern culture, I would say. It's a virtue that you can hardly even talk about. But humility means you're probably not as smart as you think you are, and you should be careful. And so then the question might be, well, okay, you should be careful, but perhaps you still want to do good, or you want to make some positive changes. How can you be careful and do good? And then I would say, well, you try not to step outside of the boundaries of your competence, and you start small. And you start with things that you actually could adjust, that you actually do understand, that you actually could fix. I mentioned to you at one point that one of the things Carl Jung said was that modern men don't see God because they don't look low enough. It's a very interesting phrase. And one of the things that I've been promoting, I suppose, online is the idea that you should restrict your attempts to fix things to what's at hand. So there's probably things about you that you could fix, right? Things that you know that aren't right. Not anyone else's opinion, your own opinion, that aren't right. You can fix them. Maybe there's some things that you could adjust in your family, although that gets hard. You have to have your act together a lot before you can start to adjust your family, because things can kick back on you really hard. And you think, well, it's hard to put yourself together. It's really hard to put your family together. Why the hell do you think you can put the world together? Right? Because obviously the world is more complicated than you and your family. And so if you're stymied in your attempts even to set your own house in order, which of course you are, then you would think that what that would do would be to make you very, very leery about announcing your broad-scale plans for social revolution. Well, it's a peculiar thing, because that isn't how it works, because people are much more likely to announce their plans for broad-scale social revolution than they are to try to set themselves straight or to set their family straight. And I think the reason for that is that as soon as they try to set themselves straight or their families, the system immediately kicks back at them, right? Instantly. Whereas if they announce their plans for large-scale social revolution, the lag between the announcement and the kickback is so long that they don't recognize that there's any error there. And so, you can get away with being wrong if nothing falls on you for a while. And it's also an incitement to hubris, because you can announce your plans for large-scale social revolution and stand back and you don't get hit by lightning, and you think, well, I might be right, even though you're not. You're seriously not right. I might be right, and then you think, well, how wonderful is that, especially if you could do it without any real effort. And I really do think fundamentally, I believe that that's what universities teach students now. That's what they teach them to do. I really believe that. And I think it's absolutely appalling. And I think it's horribly dangerous. Because it's not that easy to fix things. Especially if you're not committed to it. And I think you know if you're committed because what you try to do is you try to straighten out your own life first. And that's enough. Like I think it's a statement in the New Testament that it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city. And that's not a metaphor. It's like all of you who've made announcements to yourself about changing your diet and going to the gym every January know perfectly well how difficult it is to regulate your own impulses and to bring yourself under the control of some, what would you say, well-structured and ethical, attentive structure of values. It's extraordinarily difficult, and so people don't do it, and instead they wander off, and I think they create towers of Babel, and the story indicates, well, those things collapse under their own weight, and everyone goes their own direction. I think I see that happening with the LGBT community. I think, because one of the things I've noticed, it's very interesting because the community is some sense, it's not a community, but that's a technical error, but it's composed of outsiders, let's say. And what you notice across the decades is that the acronym list keeps growing. And I think that's because there's an infinite number of ways to be an outsider. And so once you open the door to the construction of a group that's characterized by failing to fit into the group, then you immediately create a category that's infinitely expandable. And so I don't know how long the acronym list is now. It depends on which acronym list you consult. But I've seen lists of 10 or more acronyms. And one of the things that's happening is that the community is starting to fragment in its interior because there is no unity. Once you put a sufficient plurality under the sheltering structure of a single umbrella, say, the disunity starts to appear within. And I think that's also it's a manifestation of the same issue that this particular story is dealing with. So that ends, I would say, the most archaic stories in the Bible. There's something about the flood story and also the Tower of Babel. I think they outline the two fundamental dangers that beset mankind. One is the probability that blindness and sin will produce a natural catastrophe or entice one. That's something modern people are very aware of in principle, right? Because we're all hyper concerned about environmental degradation and catastrophe. And so that's the continual reactivation of an archetypal idea in our unconscious minds, that there's something about the way we're living that's unsustainable and that will create a catastrophe. It's so interesting because people believe that firmly and deeply, but they don't see the relationship between that and the archetypal stories, because it's the same story. Overconsumption, greed, all of that is producing an unstable state, and nature will rebel and take us down, right? You hear that every day in every newspaper and every TV station. It's broadcast to you constantly. And so that idea is presented in Genesis in the story of Noah. And then the other warning that exists in the stories, one is beware of natural catastrophe that's produced as a consequence of blindness and greed, we'll say. The other is beware of social structures that overreach, because they'll also produce fragmentation and disintegration. And so it's quite remarkable, I think, that at the close of the story of the Tower of Babel, we've got both of the permanent existential dangers that present themselves to humanity already identified. At the end of the story of Adam and Eve, there's like a fall into history, right? So in one way, history begins with the fall. But there's like a second fall, I think, with the flood and the Tower of Babel. And history, in an even more real sense, begins now. It begins with the story of Abraham. And we're no longer precisely in the realm of the purely mythical. That would be another way of thinking about it. We have an identifiable person who's part of an identifiable tribe, who's doing identifiable things. We're in the realm of history. And so history begins twice in the Old Testament. I suppose it begins again after Moses as well. But we've moved out of the domain of the purely mythical into the realm of history with the emergence of the stories about Abraham. This is from Aldous Huxley. So the first thing that I want to talk about in relationship to the Abrahamic stories is this idea of the experience of God, because Abraham, although quite identifiable as an actual individual, is also characterized by this peculiarity, and the peculiarity is that God manifests himself to Abraham, both as a voice but also as a presence. The stories never describe exactly how God manifests himself, except now and then he comes in the form of an angel. That's fairly concrete. But it's a funny thing that the author of, or authors of the Abrahamic stories seems to take the idea that God would make an appearance more or less for granted. And so it's I think that part of the reason that I've struggled so much with the Abrahamic stories is because it's so hard to get a handle on that and to understand what that might mean. And so I'm going to hit it from a bunch of different perspectives, and we'll see if we can come up with some understanding of it. The first thing I'll do is tell you a story about a female neurologist whose name escapes me at the moment. She wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight. Jill Bolte, I think is her name. And she was a Harvard trained. She had medical training from Harvard in neuropsychological function and knew a lot about hemispheric specialization. We talked a little bit about hemispheric specialization before, and one of the ways of conceptualizing the difference between the two hemispheres is that the left hemisphere operates in known territory and the right hemisphere operates in unknown territory. That's one way of thinking about it. The left hemisphere operates in the orderly domain and the right hemisphere operates in the chaotic domain. Or the left hemisphere operates in the domain of detail and the right hemisphere operates in the domain of the large picture. It's something like that. Now, people differ in their neurological wiring, so those are overgeneralizations, but that's okay. We'll live with that for the time being. It's certainly not an overgeneralization to point out that you do, in fact, have two hemispheres and that their structures differ. And if the connections between them are cut, which could happen, for example, if you had surgery for intractable epilepsy, that each hemisphere would be capable of housing its own consciousness. That's been well documented by a neurologist named Gazzaniga, and Sperry, who did split brain experiments, must be 30 years ago now. So, and we know that the right and the left hemisphere are specialized for different functions. The right hemisphere, for example, seems to be more involved in the generation of negative emotion, and the left hemisphere more involved in the generation of positive emotion and approach. So the right hemisphere stops you and the left hemisphere moves you forward. Anyways, Jill Bolte, I hope I've got that right, had a stroke and maintained consciousness during the stroke and analyzed it while it was happening. And she was able, while it was happening, to hypothesize about what part of her brain was being destroyed. So she had a congenital blood vessel malformation and had an aneurysm. And it just about killed her. But she said that it affected her left hemisphere. And she said that she experienced a sense of divine unity as a consequence of the stroke, because the left hemisphere function was disrupted and destroyed. And so she became right hemisphere dominant. And her experience of that was the dissolution of the specific ego into absolute consciousness, something like that. Now, that's only a case study, and you don't want to make too much of case studies, but there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that those two kinds of consciousness exist. One being your consciousness of you as a localized and specified being, and the other being this capacity to experience oceanic dissolution and the sense of the cosmos being one. Now, why we have those capacities for different conscious experiences is very difficult to understand. I mean, part of me thinks that maybe we have a generic human brain that's the brain of the species. And allied with that, we have a specific individual brain. And one is the left hemisphere and the other is the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere being the specific individual brain. And usually it's on and working because you obviously have to take care of yourself as a specific entity and not as a generalized cosmic phenomena. It's hard to dice celery when you're a generalized cosmic phenomena, right? So you have to be more pointed than that. But look, let's make no mistake about it. The fact that those different states of consciousness exist is not disputable. They can be elicited in all sorts of ways. And so I'm going to read you something that Aldous Huxley wrote about this back, I think in 1956. This was after he started his experimentation with mescaline. Because the psychedelics were introduced into Western culture in the 1950s in a whole bunch of different ways. Psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, that was discovered right at the end of World War II. It was discovered by accident, actually, in a laboratory, Sandoz Labs. The guy who discovered it, Albert Hofmann, had spilled some on his hands. You could absorb it through your skin. And he was biking home and had the world's first LSD trip, which was somewhat of a shock to him, and then to the entire world. Huxley, who was a great literary figure, a real genius, experimented with mescaline in the late 50s. And he wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which had a huge impact on the emerging psychedelic culture, both on the East Coast at Harvard and on the West Coast with Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters, the people who popularized LSD. That's all documented in a book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which I would highly recommend. It's Tom Wolfe. It's a brilliant book. On the East Coast, it was Timothy Leary. I had Timothy Leary's old job at Harvard. So that was kind of cool, in a warped way. So I met people there who knew him, who didn't think much of him also, but who did know him. But Huxley had this mescaline experience, and it transported him to this alternative consciousness. And he said that during his mescaline experience that the entire world glowed from within, like if there was an inner light, like a paradisal inner light, and that everything was deeply meaningful and symbolically suggestive and overwhelming and beautiful and timeless. So he had an experience of divine eternity, I suppose, is the most straightforward way to put that. And we know perfectly well that the psychedelic drugs that all share the same chemical structure, they interact with the brain chemical called serotonin, which is a very, very fundamental neurotransmitter. They all have approximately the same range of effects, although those effects are there's a very large multitude of effects that sort of exist underneath that umbrella. Huxley was staggered by his mescaline experience. He didn't really know what to make of it. And I think that that's the common experience of people who have exceptionally profound psychedelic experiences. And I'll tell you some documentation about that in a moment. But he spent quite a long time trying to come to grips with what this might mean from an intellectual perspective. And Huxley had a great brain. I mean, if someone was going to wrestle with a problem like that, he was a good candidate. He must have had a verbal IQ of 180. I mean, his books are incredibly literate, incredible mastery of language and complexity of characterization and intellectual discourse. Really remarkable. So this is what Huxley had to say after his mescaline experience. He talked about heaven and hell. And he talked about that in reference to bad trips, essentially, because it was known by that point that a psychedelic experience could transport you to an ecstatic domain of divine revelation, but could take you to the worst imaginable place as well. And Huxley was very interested in why you would even have the capacity for experiences like that, and which I think is a very good question, and it's a completely unanswered question. I mean, we don't know much about consciousness, and we know even less about psychedelics, I would say. They are an absolute mystery. I don't think we understand them in the least. Huxley did a good job of starting to at least map out the mysteries of the terrain. He said, like the Earth of 100 years ago, our mind still has its darkest Africas, its unmapped Borneos and Amazonian basins. In relation to the fauna, of these regions. We are not yet zoologists. We are mere naturalists and collectors of specimens. The fact is unfortunate, but we have to accept it. We have to make the best of it. However lowly, the work of the collector must be done before we can proceed to the higher scientific tasks of classification, analysis, experiment, and theory making. Like the giraffe and the duck-billed platypus, the creatures inhabiting these remoter regions of the mind are exceedingly improbable. Nevertheless, they exist. They are facts of observation. And as such, they cannot be ignored by anyone who is honestly trying to understand the world in which he lives. When psychiatrists started to study LSD, that was mostly in the late 50s and running forward from that, they thought about the drug as a psychotomimetic, which was a chemical substance that would induce psychosis. But that turned out to not be true, not with the psychedelics, because schizophrenics were given LSD, and the schizophrenics reported that while the experience was certainly extraordinarily strange, it wasn't like being schizophrenic. And then it was found later that if you gave schizophrenics amphetamines, that made them worse. In fact, you can induce a paranoid psychosis in a normal person by overdosing them with amphetamines. So whatever the hallucinogens or the psychedelics are doing, it's not the same thing as mania, and it's not the same thing as schizophrenia. Not at all. So you can't just write the experience off as an induced psychosis. Whatever it is, independent of its utility or lack thereof, it's not that. Now, it can be induced by drugs. It can be induced by deprivation, right? I mean, there are accounts throughout history of people putting themselves in extreme physiological situations in order to induce transformations of consciousness. Fasting is one of the routes to doing that. Dancing is another route. Isolation, prolonged periods of isolation will also do it. Now, you could say that exposing yourself to any of those in excess produces a state that's indistinguishable from illness, and that there's no reason to assume that the phenomena that are associated with illness have any utility whatsoever. Although it's interesting to me that a disrupted consciousness can produce coherent experiences. It's not exactly what you expect if it was just an illness. You know, if you develop, say, a high fever, your experience isn't transcendent and coherent. It's fragmented and pathologized. And the difference, I think, is quite distinct. Although we don't have to only speculate about that, because there's been enough experimental work done now with hallucinogens and psychedelics to indicate that the notion that what they produce is something that's only akin to pathology is wrong. It's not a matter of opinion at this point in the sequence of scientific and historical investigation. In fact, there was a large-scale study done 5 years ago, of 200,000 people who had experimented with psychedelics, and they were mentally and physically healthier than people who hadn't on virtually every parameter they examined. In fact, the rate of flashbacks, you've heard of LSD flashbacks, mostly a hypothetical phenomena, but the rate of self-reported flashbacks was higher among the non-psychedelic users than among the psychedelic users. So that was very interesting. It was a huge study. Now, it might be, you could say that those who had experimented with psychedelics were prone to be healthier to begin with, but that still contradicts the pathology argument, so it doesn't matter either way. The pathology argument is contradicted.